The town of Havenwood, nestled in the heart of America's Rust Belt, was a place where nothing ever happened. Neighbors knew each other's first names, doors were left unlocked, and the biggest news story was the high school football team's winning streak. That all changed on a cold November morning. The kind of morning when the sky hangs low and gray, and the first frost turns the world to glass. That's when police found the body of Sarah Jenkins, a bright, ambitious 22-year-old, in the woods just outside of town. The discovery didn't just break the town's peace, it shattered it. Sarah was the daughter of a prominent judge, a girl who had her whole life ahead of her. Her death was brutal, senseless, and unlike anything Havenwood had ever seen. The local police, a small force of a dozen officers, were immediately overwhelmed. The media descended, turning the sleepy town into a circus. Every detail of Sarah's life was scrutinized, every friend and acquaintance questioned. The pressure to find her killer was immense. Days turned into weeks, and the initial flood of tips dwindled to a trickle. The case, once a raging fire of public outrage, began to smolder, threatening to become another unsolved mystery. Then a break. A massive one. Forensic analysis of DNA found at the scene matched a man named Marcus Thorne. Marcus was a local, but he wasn't from Havenwood. He had moved there 3 years prior, a quiet man who kept to himself. He worked a blue-collar job at the local mill and lived in a small, run-down house on the outskirts of town. He didn't fit the profile of the town's upstanding citizens. He was an outsider, a loner, and now he was a prime suspect. The police arrested him. The local news ran his mugshot, his face plastered across every screen. The town breathed a collective sigh of relief. They had their monster. Justice, it seemed, was about to be served. But Marcus Thorne's trial was not what anyone expected. It was a circus, a spectacle that captured the nation's attention, and in the end, it did not provide the closure everyone craved. The prosecution's case was built almost entirely on the DNA evidence. They argued that the chances of anyone else's DNA matching were astronomical. Marcus had no alibi, and his quiet, reclusive nature was painted as a sign of his guilt. The defense, however, introduced an element no one saw coming: doubt. Marcus Thorne's lawyer, a sharp, enigmatic man named Elias Vance, began to methodically dismantle the prosecution's seemingly airtight case. He didn't just challenge the evidence, he challenged the entire narrative. He suggested there was a deeper, darker truth the town was desperate to hide. A conspiracy. The trial lasted for weeks, each day more dramatic than the last. Vance called expert witnesses who questioned the chain of custody for the DNA evidence. He argued that the sample could have been contaminated or even planted. He pointed out the rushed nature of the police investigation, the way they had zeroed in on Marcus so quickly. But the most explosive testimony came from Marcus himself. He spoke in a calm, measured voice, telling a story that seemed impossible, yet resonated with an unsettling ring of truth. He claimed he knew Sarah. Not well, but he had helped her with a flat tire on the same road where she was found 2 days before her death. It was a simple act of kindness, but he claimed it put him in the wrong place at the wrong time. He had a brief, fleeting interaction with her, and in the rush, perhaps his DNA was transferred. It was a thin explanation, but Vance used it to plant a seed of doubt. Why didn't the police look into this? Why was this information not in their reports? The prosecution scoffed, calling it a desperate fabrication. But the seed had been planted. Vance then shifted his focus, asking Marcus about his past. Marcus revealed that he wasn't just a mill worker. He was a former investigative journalist who had been living under the radar, hiding from a story that had cost him everything. A story about a powerful, corrupt family. A family he claimed that had ties to Havenwood. The jury was now captivated. The court of public opinion was split. Was Marcus a cold-blooded killer inventing a fantastical story, or was he a truth-teller being framed by a powerful cabal? The climax of the trial came when Vance introduced a previously unreleased audio recording. It was a phone call between Sarah Jenkins and an unknown male voice, made just hours before her death. On the recording, Sarah sounded terrified. She was whispering, begging the person on the other end not to release something. "You don't understand," she pleaded. "It's not just about me. It's about all of us." The audio cut off with a muffled scream. The recording was never made public by the police. The prosecution argued it was a red herring, inadmissible evidence, but Vance fought hard. He claimed it was proof that Sarah's death was not a random act, but a targeted hit related to what she knew. He argued that the people on the phone, the people she was begging, were the real killers and they were still out there. The courtroom erupted. The judge, in a fit of rage, struck the evidence from the record, but it was too late. The jury had heard it. The verdict, when it finally came, was a hung jury. A mistrial. The judge was furious. The prosecution vowed to retry the case, but the damage was done. The public was divided. Half believed Marcus was an innocent man, a pawn in a larger game. The other half believed he was a cunning killer who had manipulated the system. He was released on bail, but the specter of a second trial hung over his head. The town of Havenwood was no longer a quiet community. It was a powder keg of suspicion and paranoia. The story of the Havenwood conspiracy was just beginning. In the aftermath of the mistrial, the media storm only intensified. Investigative journalists from major news outlets descended upon Havenwood, digging into the pasts of everyone involved. They were looking for the conspiracy that Elias Vance had so convincingly hinted at. Their primary target, Judge Alastair Jenkins, Sarah's father. Judge Jenkins was a revered figure, a man of quiet authority who had served on the bench for over 30 years. He was a pillar of the community. But whispers began to circulate. Rumors of his ties to a powerful, secretive corporation known as the Orion Group, a company that had bought up vast tracts of land around Havenwood in recent years. The company's plans for the land were vague, but locals feared it was a front for a massive, environmentally destructive project. A project that would change the town forever. It was revealed that Sarah Jenkins, a passionate environmentalist, had been working on a research project for her university. The project focused on the ecological impact of corporate development in small-town America. Her research, it was speculated, had led her directly to the Orion Group. And to her father. Marcus Thorne, now living in a safe house provided by a sympathetic journalism foundation, began his own investigation, this time in the open. He was no longer a defendant. He was a de facto investigator, a man with nothing left to lose. He used his old connections, his deep understanding of information gathering, to pick up where Sarah had left off. He found a hidden network of shell corporations, all leading back to the Orion Group. And at the head of that network was not just Judge Jenkins, but several other prominent figures in the state government. The conspiracy was real, and it went far deeper than anyone had imagined. The evidence he uncovered pointed to a massive bribery scheme, a plan to illegally rezone Havenwood surrounding land to allow for a toxic waste disposal site, a project that would have made the local elite incredibly wealthy while destroying the town's environment and economy. Sarah, it seemed, had discovered the plan. And she had paid the ultimate price for it. The audio recording, the one that was dismissed in court, now became the central piece of a new public narrative. Marcus's foundation released a professionally enhanced version of the recording. The male voice was now recognizable. It belonged to Martin Davies, the president of the Orion Group, and a close friend of Judge Jenkins. The phone call wasn't a threat, it was a desperate plea. Martin was pleading with Sarah to not go public with what she knew. He was begging her not to expose his conspiracy, not to ruin her father. The muffled scream at the end wasn't a struggle. It was the sound of a phone being dropped as someone else entered the room. The new information pointed the finger at the men behind the conspiracy, not Marcus. But it still didn't answer the central question. Who killed Sarah? The second act of this tragedy unfolded in a series of shocking revelations. The spotlight was now on Martin Davies and his associates. The police, under pressure from the FBI, reopened the investigation. But the local police, the same force that had rushed to arrest Marcus, were deeply entrenched in the conspiracy. The chief of police, it was revealed, had a hidden bank account with multiple six-figure deposits from an untraceable shell corporation. A shell corporation that was, in fact, part of the Orion Group. The evidence now suggested a massive cover-up. The police had been ordered to pin the murder on an outsider, a fall guy. Marcus Thorne was the perfect target. He had no powerful friends, no family in town, and a past that made him an easy villain. The plan was to convict him quickly, bury the case, and move forward with the toxic waste project. But Marcus and Elias Vance, now a duo of legal crusaders, weren't finished. They had to prove who had actually killed Sarah. They looked at the events of that fateful night, reconstructing the timeline with painstaking detail. Sarah had been in her car, on her way to a meeting with a journalist she had contacted after her father refused to listen to her. That journalist was Marcus Thorne. But she never made it to the meeting. The phone call with Martin Davies took place as she was leaving her house. The call ended abruptly, and she was found dead in the woods hours later. The key to the murder, they realized, was not the conspiracy itself, but the moment it was discovered. The person who killed Sarah was someone who learned of her plan to go public in the last moments of her life. A person who was not just part of the conspiracy, but who had a motive for a spur-of-the-moment act of violence. The trail led them to the person who was with Martin Davies at the time of the phone call. Judge Alastair Jenkins. It was a cold, hard truth, a truth that ripped the town's fabric apart. Sarah's father was her killer. He had been there, he had heard the phone call, he had learned that his daughter was about to go public and expose him. In a moment of panic, in a desperate attempt to protect his life's work and reputation, he had snapped. He had followed her, confronted her, and in a terrible, twisted moment of rage and fear, he had taken her life. The new evidence was brought to light. A witness came forward, a groundskeeper at Judge Jenkins' estate who had seen a heated argument between the judge and his daughter on the night of the murder. He had heard her say, "You're going to jail, Dad." Another witness, a hunter, had seen a car matching Judge Jenkins pulling into the woods just a few minutes before the projected time of death. The case was no longer circumstantial. It was a web of evidence, all pointing to the man who was meant to protect the law. The trial of Judge Alastair Jenkins was even more dramatic than the first. The prosecution, now a new team from the State Attorney General's office, laid out the case meticulously. They showed the jury the web of corruption, the bribery, the shell corporations. They played the audio recording, now with a full transcript. They brought in the witnesses who had seen the judge with his daughter on the night of the murder. The defense tried to argue that it was all a fabrication, a conspiracy to protect a known killer, Marcus Thorne. But the jury and the nation knew better. The verdict was swift and unanimous: guilty. Alastair Jenkins, a man who had sworn to uphold justice, was convicted of the murder of his own daughter. The story of the Havenwood conspiracy didn't end with a conviction. It ended with a reckoning. The legal battle was over, but the moral and social aftermath was just beginning. The toxic waste project was exposed and shut down, but the corruption it had brought to light was vast and pervasive. The chief of police was arrested and charged with obstruction of justice. The mayor and several city council members were forced to resign. The Orion Group was dissolved, its assets frozen, and its president, Martin Davies, was indicted on a multitude of charges. The town of Havenwood, once a symbol of small-town Americana, was now a symbol of something else: the rot that can fester beneath the surface of respectability. The town was no longer a place of unlocked doors and neighborly trust. It was a place of suspicion and broken faith. But amidst the rubble, something new began to grow. A new generation of leaders, inspired by the courage of Sarah Jenkins and the tenacity of Marcus Thorne, began to rebuild. They cleaned up the corruption, held the powerful accountable, and worked to restore the town's trust in its institutions. The story became a cautionary tale, a lesson in the dangers of turning a blind eye to injustice, no matter how quiet or insidious it may seem. And what of Marcus Thorne? He was exonerated, his name cleared. The true crime podcaster who had once been a pariah was now a hero. His face, once a symbol of guilt, was now a symbol of truth. He didn't stay in Havenwood. He had done his part, and the town, for all its new promise, still held too many painful memories. He went back to journalism, this time in the open, using his platform to expose other conspiracies, other acts of injustice. The story of the true crime conspiracy that divided a nation is not just about a murder. It's about a fundamental question. When the system is rigged, when the people in charge are the ones committing the crimes, can justice ever truly be served? In this case it was. But not by the system itself. It was served by a brave young woman who paid with her life, a determined man who refused to be silenced, and a community that, in the end, chose truth over comfort. It was a victory, but a bittersweet one. The memory of Sarah Jenkins, her young life cut short by the very person who was supposed to protect her, was a scar that would forever mark the town of Havenwood. And a reminder that sometimes, the greatest conspiracies are not hidden in the shadows, but in plain sight, behind the smiling faces of the people we trust the most.